These are excerpts from an interview by Marc Bosch. Marc has been a friend of mine for quite a number of years now. I met him when he first started working on his four-dimensional game Miegakure, which he is still working on. He's one of the few people who really understands the kind of design that I do at a deep level, so it was an interesting conversation. So I'm thinking of like the beginning of World 2-4, where there's a puzzle piece right above the entry door and there's like nothing near it. And you're like, how am I supposed to get this? There's a monster there and it just sort of seems like it's a thing to dodge and avoid and maybe get killed by, and then you rewind or whatever. But really, you like get the monster back to the other side. And it's like, is that a rewind puzzle? Not really. I mean, I don't know, man. It's an interesting puzzle. It's weird because aesthetically, it feels like it does the right thing in a number of ways. You have this challenge that's very minimal and looks impossible. There's just like a puzzle piece in the air. What are you going to do about that? And then there's misdirection to it because that monster way over there doesn't seem like it's relevant. It seems like the goal is to guard you from going forward, and you have to do something quite specific to solve it, because you have to catch the monster on the monster walks fast enough that he'll probably fall in the pit and die, and so you have to catch him on the platform with the right timing to just barely get him across, and then you have to like jump over him or something without killing him. So it's pretty hard to do accidentally, which is a hallmark of a good puzzle, and the rewind helps you with that.
What ended up in the game is then sort of these panels of text, which are very much like Einstein's dream in my mind, where it's trying to do a metaphor for what the mechanic is about, and then the gameplay, which is very mechanical and like doesn't really connect to the metaphor directly. So like those two elements feel a little bit disconnected to me, but also like you sort of explained how that came about. So I'm interested if you have anything more to say about that.
I mean, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Like, I definitely knew that some people weren't going to care about the fiction part of the game. Because especially when you make a 2D platformer, you have some idea of... I just could very easily imagine somebody not wanting to read the story. And in fact, that was very clear. And actually, in the original prototype, the story parts they were just like on a screen, like introducing World 2. Here's a giant page of text.
Right.
Press spacebar to continue. And that you could especially see people start reading it and then go like, skip, I want to play the game, which is what I would do with most games today as well. Unless like I have to, if I sit down in front of a game and it starts doing story stuff, really like what I'm seeing in order to stay with it, because otherwise I don't have faith that this thing is going to be any good. And I just let me get to the part where I get to do something, right? But so the way that I squared that a little bit, I was like, I want the story things to be a little bit more interactive, but I do want them to be together and coherent as a story segment. Like one thing you could imagine is that instead of being front-loaded story in front of each world like this, like Cave Story had been out for a long time, right? And that just, you meet characters over the course of this linear platformer and they tell you things, and those things come together to make the narrative, right? It's like AAA games did for a long time, but it's like the indie version of that. And that could have been the model for this, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to very straightforwardly be influenced by books. And one of the things about books, as different from some other things, especially the way games adopt them, is that books kind of want you to have an attention span, right? Because it's this long sequence of text. And I don't know if I ever explicitly had that as a mission statement, but I definitely felt that way. It's like, look, if you want to have an attention span and read this, that's fine. If you don't, I'm going to set it up so that it's in pieces and you could just sort of run by all the pieces, you know. But like I could have, you know, in those little book stands that are in the game, those could have just been scattered throughout the worlds and you could have encountered them as you could. That would be a very easy change. But then it would be harder to get the coherent picture of them put together, which might have been good in some ways, because I did like this idea of an activity of trying to put together the ideas of the story and what is going on, but I just really wanted it to be front loaded that way, you know?
I think it is nice that you have those two separate pieces and they sort of like bounce off each other, which you wouldn't get if you...
It's definitely a thing that some people complain about, but, you know, you can't listen to everybody's complaints, right?
So, yeah, you have to decide something.
Yeah, that's like I could have done it, but it would have been a fairly different game, you know, if we and what would that decision have been based on, right? Like, I kind of have a fear that, maybe a realistic fear, that a lot of players will not want to read something. So let me design for that. It's like, okay, but like, maybe it's not that experimental of a game in that dimension anymore. Like, I wanted to do this thing that I hadn't seen games do.
All right, so the thing that struck me the most when I played Braid was how minimalistic the puzzle design felt. And I think that was like sort of the thing that blew me away the most, maybe, I want to say. And I was wondering if you had more thoughts on that. I've sort of heard you talk about it a little bit, but maybe we can go deeper there.
That's a direction that I went more in over time, that I kind of discovered while I was working on the game. There definitely was more complex level geometry in the beginning and more monsters and stuff. I think one idea that I had early on was I want levels to fit on one screen so that they're framed, like whenever possible. Like sometimes it'll be fun to have bigger levels, but if everything fits on one screen and you're thinking about a hard puzzle, you can see all the elements right there. And you're taking away some artificial difficulty and you get to the essence of the puzzle, right? Good puzzles are going to be things where you can see all the information. And that means they're not that complicated. And I had played puzzle games where the reason the puzzle was hard is because you have to do 17 things in the right order or whatever. And I was like, no, that's not this game, because this game should be about time. Because I'd been doing experimental gameplay workshop, I had this idea that every puzzle should be on theme for the particular world. And so if something is on theme, how complicated can it be? Because if there's some specific idea about it, if that idea only takes place in one part of the puzzle, what's the rest of the puzzle doing? It's kind of dead weight on that. Unless the idea happens multiple times to like fill out. Mm-hmm. But that's hard. It's like a lot harder to design one idea taking place in multiple ways. We actually do that on the new game a little bit. And actually Zach is really good at that. He's maybe the best person I've ever seen at that particular thing. So I think that gravitated towards simpler puzzles, but also just sometimes I would be working on a puzzle and I would be unhappy with it because it looks ugly or just this thing is weird. And then I would delete the thing that was weird and I would like it more. And I kept seeing that trend. I was like, okay, this game is better when I'm more minimal. But that was only something that I really had clarity about, I would say, by the middle or 2/3 of the way through development, for sure.
Is there more to say about why there is a puzzle actually in the world? Like, why did you want to do that? And
that was just the idea that I had, right? Like, that was the, so there's the question, how do you get collectibles and make them meaningful? People probably don't think about it as a collectible, but, you know, in Braid, a different way that this happens is as you solve each world, I guess it's once you complete the actual puzzle piece, then that stairway sort of shows up and you can get up to the attic, and it's sort of like you're collecting the stairway pieces, right? But that's a way of making it matter because you can go climb on those stairs even when they're incomplete, right? And you're like, oh, I can get up 2 of them, but then this one's gone, but I see if that were in place, I could go up 2 more. And like it just, even though logically speaking, you need 5 out of 5, right? It's just better in some way. And so with the puzzle pieces, it's like, okay, why collect puzzle pieces? 1, it like matters. 2, it could tie into the story because you have an image right? That you're gradually revealing, and it gave pacing that you can play with. So that's why there are puzzle frames in the middle of levels often. It's to give you a break and some variety in what you're doing in the middle of the level before you go back and do like more hard puzzles. It's like, oh, I can, if I got 5 of the pieces, I could try putting them together, or I could, if they don't fit quite, I could at least look at them and try and figure out what corner this corner is, even if it doesn't attach to something, or I can try to figure out what the scene's going to be. You have a gradual reveal of the scene that's going to be in the image. All those things are positive, and I didn't have a different idea that was better, that had as many positives.
So then did you place those panels where you have to put the puzzles in locations where you thought people needed breaks, or?
I think so. Also, though, like it was a general heuristic that I'm trying to give people a nice break in the middle, but it's also just a little bit intuition and a little bit trying to work with the designs of levels that I have. And like sometimes I felt a little bit stuck, like the ideal for this place for this puzzle frame would be here, but I kind of can't do that without destroying the level because it's too tight. So I have to put it on the next level and it's not quite where I would like it to be or whatever. There's also, this is kind of an unspoken rule in the game, but I believe you'll find it intact. They're never at the beginning of a level because you like have to get to them. It's like
a reward.
You have to earn it a little bit somehow. Yeah. So they're usually toward the end. It actually would have been fun to put one at the beginning of a level, but I just never did that.
The pattern breaking thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I don't feel that the explanation I gave Marc about why there are puzzle pieces in the game was very easy to follow, so I'll try to clarify. As a baseline, there could have just been a counter. Each time you solve a puzzle, you get a star or something that then disappears and no longer exists except as a number. And when that number gets to 12, you've finished that world. But when I imagined the game working this way, it made the puzzles feel more arbitrary, in my estimation at least. I wanted puzzles to feel grounded and interesting and important, like you're working towards something other than just raising a number. Making the collectibles into puzzle pieces gives the player a new activity to do, on which he can make partial progress between puzzles. And this isn't just busy work, because the puzzle image communicates something, and each time the player connects another piece, he gradually figures out what the image is showing, and that's interesting. But the image isn't just random information. It refers to the subject matter in the story screens and the overall thematics of the game. So having you collect physical puzzle pieces also connects the puzzle gameplay to the story in a way it wouldn't otherwise be. The ladders to the attic are a similar idea. It could just be a number, and when the number gets to 5, you reach the end game. But I felt it was important to instantiate that number physically in the game, even though the ladders are not as rich or interesting as the puzzle pieces. They really can't be, because there are so few. You know, one of the levels that shows up again in the game a few times is this level called the Pit.
Yeah, I was going to ask
and
about
it's
that
super. It's one of the most minimal. It's literally
it's
one screen, and there's a pit.
Yeah.
And then what can we do with
it
that?
happens
right?
like 5 times too, which is great.
Yeah. And so that, in the original prototype of the game, that was the level where I introduced the magic key. And the magic key was the predecessor to the current World 3 stuff we were talking about, where things don't rewind. But the idea back then was like, okay, the key doesn't rewind. It's just like special. So there was no sparkles. It wasn't like a modifier on objects the way that it is now. It simply was, the key is kind of cool. And I was like, okay, what's a simple way that you demonstrate that to people? Well, I want to force them to figure it out and have this epiphany from figuring it out. What if they have to go into a pit and get the key, and the pit is a little higher than they can jump? So maybe they think that they could jump out, but you jump in and then you're just stuck, and then you basically have to rewind out. And then, you know, if you go and you look at this level, it was a very long level that totally doesn't fit on the screen, and you go to the right for a while, you jump on some monsters or whatever, and then I was following game design advice, traditional good game design advice, which is, before you find a key, you must encounter the locked door and not be able to proceed.
Okay.
Because otherwise you don't appreciate the key. Otherwise you just get the key.
Of
right?
course, right.
Now I have violated that rule sort of in the final game because you have the pit and then the gate on the other side and you get the key first or you encounter the key first. But because it's 2D and it all fits on one screen, you see the gate and it's kind of fine, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think what it's saying is you should frustrate the player first there so that they appreciate it, which doesn't mean they have to see it. They just have to feel frustrated.
I don't know if it's about frustrated even, but it's like if you get a key and then you see a locked door that looks like a really badass locked door, but you just have the key. You don't even maybe realize when you picked it up.
Right. Yeah. That's sort
then
of
it's
what
like
I mean.
a nothing burger, and nothing burgers feel bad.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about avoiding that
right.
kind of a thing.
Which
too.
you've succeeded at that, right? Because you fall into the pit and then you don't know what to do. And then therefore that's the part where you're like, oh, I need to be doing something. Something needs to happen. It's just not given to you.
Yes. But to go back to the original level, it was, so you would go left to right along the ground, right? You would run into this gate and you're blocked. So you climb up this trellis and like back left. And then over here, there's like a pit. And it didn't fit vertically, so it was like kind of half scrolled off the screen. And then you would go into this pit over here and be stuck and come back out and come down and around. It was way less elegant. It was ugly. I mean, it worked. Like mechanically, I could have shipped that level, right? But I turned that level into the absolute minimum thing that you see because it was like, okay, what is actually good about this, right? And then what do I really need to do that thing that's good? And then also, I had just some idea of, hey, it's really cool to do things with the minimum amount, right? That's sort of an Eastern aesthetic to some degree. There's some Western traditions that do this too, but like what can I do something highly effective with a minimum amount of material, right? And it's a game design application of that idea. And then once I did that a few times, I saw that it was working, I guess.
Is it a programmer thing as well? Or like, do you think it's sort of your programmer part, like liking elegance in design, like minimum code for what it's doing, things like that?
It's quite possible. I mean, I didn't have that association in my head very deliberately at the time, but
yeah, of course.
It could be just that I trained myself that way to appreciate that.
Okay, that's interesting.
Now it's weird because the aesthetics of the game visually are not minimal, right? Like the style, the painterly style of the game is very much not minimal. So it's not like I'm saying minimalism in all places is the right thing, but it's complicated. Right?
Well, I don't think minimalism is always the right thing or not. I mean, it's just an aesthetic that you can decide to pick, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go for minimalism, and that's what the game is going to be about. And then there are going to be some good things and some bad things that come out of that.
Yeah.
So World 6 is the problem that I have is that it's again, like, I think it's all very clean design, so I don't have
anything to say about it. Yeah, that's fine.
There's one tiny thing where like that's sort of related, where you put the flower where you're supposed to put the ring.
I mean, so that whole puzzle is more messy than I would like. So in a game like that, where things move continuously, then making a puzzle clean is kind of about avoiding proximity between wrong solutions and right solutions in terms of like how close they get you to the goal. A dumb example is if you're not supposed to be able to jump across a gap, that gap should be really wide, right? So that you don't think that that's what you're supposed to be trying to do. In this particular puzzle, it was really hard to get it to feel clean, actually. A related but different puzzle is the one we talked about with putting the ring on the cannon.
Right.
That one is cleaner because there's kind of nowhere else to put it. In this one we're talking about, you could put the ring on the ground, and it does affect you, but not quite enough. It's less clear that it's failure, I guess. And maybe that's why, the real reason why I put the flower there is, like, I don't expect people to actively use that as a hint how to solve the puzzle unless they have some weird intuition moment. Really what it was is, after you solve it, it's a little bit cute that like, oh, that flower is there as a thing of where I should put this. But also it's a little bit cute because that flower is in the earlier version of the level. Because this is a reprise of a World 3, and that has the flower as well. And you don't really know why at the time. And it's for this, moderately tenuous, but definitely there's a point to it reason that happens way later in the game. And I just like that. It's not very logical. It's not even necessarily very playable, you know, but it's just a thing that's there.
It's again interesting to contrast that in this case you were okay with helping the player.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in part because I felt that it's a little messy. Like I just remember there being a lot of adjustment to like get the timing good. I mean, I could have put more gaps that you jump over or something, but I opted for simplicity in the end.
You could have like a granulated thing too, where like there's pits that you could put it in, so like it discretizes the locations.
Yeah. I guess I just felt like that was too complicated and
Hmm.
ugly, right? Although, the judgment of how ugly things is, often in design, we're making that based on the mock-up level. And then when you do like the final graphics, it could get a fiction to it and a visual pleasantness that makes you not mind it so much.
Mm-mm. And I thought that puzzle is doing the thing that is very common, I think, in puzzle design, where you make the obvious thing the wrong thing, and you have the right thing sort of away in a pit where you have to go through and get the object. This sort of misdirection of like, here, try it first, do it wrong, then see what you've done wrong, and then now you have to figure out how to do it correctly. But I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? I started out, I saw the kind of a situation was unfolding like you're talking about. And then like you also see what opportunities you can do given this scenario, right? And so this is one instance of a thing that I do in the game where it's not the most blatant instance, but I say, okay, you're supposed to know how this works by now. So I'm going to set you up to screw up and fail and do the wrong thing if you're just like blindly playing through the game. It's like an interesting way of reminding people that it matters to do the right thing without making a big complicated scenario like a maze where you have to like try to find the key or whatever. It's like, look, you just put the wrong one right there. And in fact, you can open the first gate, I think, and it's fine. And it's like, so yeah, this key, right? It's the wrong key, but this is still savable, right? It's just a rewindable key and a rewindable gate. And like, I go back and get this one, right? You don't actually really fail the puzzle until you go all the way down here, find another key, don't really think about whether it's the right key or not, and then use it, right? And then at that point, it's too late. Now, there's some other interesting stuff happening, right? So if I rewind here back to the point where I have the other key, why do I have the other key exactly now? Like, how do you pick up a key? Well, you intersect with the bounding box of the key, it sets the carrying state, whatever, right? What if there's two keys? How do you decide? Well, if they all have the same properties, it doesn't matter, but that's not a situation that ever happens in the game, actually, right? So here, there's a hidden rule that says the rewind exempt key is lower priority than the other key, and that's the only place I think that really matters is this specific puzzle. But yeah, so I mentioned, if I put the other key a little bit further to the left, you would still see them both and it might engage it. But I wanted people to like preemptively realize what was going on or get caught. And I think most people get caught, even people who understand the game, right?
Yeah.
But I think for me it was enough to give you another place to go that obviously went out of sight. And it's like, well, you just weren't that curious about what was down there, were you, right? You just decided to go use the key first. And it's fine until you use the second key on the second gate, and then
that should be obvious. It's like I've got no more keys. As soon as I intersect this gate, this key is going to break and the gate's going to be open, and there's still one more gate. And I've been everywhere on the level now, right? I've seen what's down the pit. You should, before you do that, know that it's going to fail, but people usually fail anyway. And I kind of like that as a designer, right? I'm like, okay, I want to do this.
Why?
Because it's funny.
And so it's just a little bit more like, why put the key all the way down the pit and not just like on the other side of those plants? Those plants felt like already enough.
Because I didn't want the player to see the other key.
And why didn't you want the player to see the other key?
Because it just felt better. So when I start designing the puzzle, I'm like, okay, 2 keys, 3 gates. If there's more than 2 gates, there either have to be 2 keys, or you have a rewind exempt gate like pasted 5 times. And that might be funny.
Right, yeah.
Like, that's maybe a thing we could do. Maybe we'll do that in the commentary area. But I just like this better, right? When I was thinking through the preliminary, okay, there's going to be 2 keys. How do you present the 2 keys? Are they equidistant from the player somehow? That's actually very hard to achieve in a 2D platformer.
You'd have to put them on 2 platforms, and you start on the left and you can go up or down or something.
Yeah, but then like down is going to be like easier, you know, or one of them is going to be closer to the center of the screen. Like, you can't actually make them equal. So I didn't think that hard about it, right? And I got to do a little bit of fun stuff with, like, okay, it's not only like buried off the screen, but it's deep in a pit that you have to rewind yourself out of, right? So that's a little bit of a reprise from the beginning, but it's also, again, it's to kind of make very clear that this is a rewind exempt key, and you should be thinking about that with regards to the solution of this puzzle, right? Like, if you just pick it up, it's like, okay, I see that it's sparkling, right? But no, it's like, I have to utilize the property of the key to get the key to begin with, in a way that I've already seen. It was in the first level of this world, but still, I think it's a little bit more of the setup of why it feels like the player's fault when they screw up, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I did highlight the fact that the key was not rewindable, so when you broke it and then you couldn't rewind it, you really kind of knew. Like, you know? So if I had put the key on the screen so you saw them both, there are some tricks you can do where one of them is more framed and the other one's off to the side, but I didn't feel like that would be very strong. And I wanted to trick people in this one, actually. But it is a very, that is a judgment call, right? Many other designers would do a different thing according to their own personality. So it's rare to have the ability to think about things in a game in a different way. And so I really enjoy when I get the opportunity to do that. You know, when we get to stuff like why set up the keys in that way? Why do you think it's funny if people do it wrong? That's just kind of personal taste for that game, even. And I don't do that always. Like Witness does some funny things, but it does them in a different way, right? Like Witness has a puzzle that's funny, that's easy once you realize why it's funny, right? And it's like, oh, there's just different ways to do it. And I think because Braid's a game where you kind of die on spikes a lot and you stomp on monsters that don't really deserve it, like they were just there. It's like, why are you jumping on them? It's got a little bit of a masochistic streak in it, especially, and that's in the fiction of the game as well, to some degree.
It has that vibe of, oh, I should have thought about this. You know, like I'm just on zombie mode right now, and I should be more aware. Like, it brings you back, which is good.
Time is bidirectional, right? This is one of the things that survived sort of from the original set of ideas about quantum mechanics and relativity, because one of the things we see in physics at all levels, actually, even in like Newtonian physics, the laws of physics are bidirectional with respect to time. Like, the only reason that time seems to go more strongly in one direction is like friction and inertia and stuff. It's like a statistic. What is friction? It's like statistical collisions working out a certain way. The beginning of time is a low entropy state, and the end of time is a high entropy state. And it looks to us while we're inside that like it's just things happening and then you get more entropy out. But if you like were to stand way back and look at the whole thing, it's like a very simple shape, right? So then when you get into quantum mechanics, it's a little more complicated, but there's this thing called CPT conservation where, you know, the product of these things, it's charge, parity, and direction of time, right? So if you reverse time, if you negate the charge, something like that. But like there's a way that it works out, and it's invariant.
Right. So you flip one and then the other is flipped.
Because,
yeah. Okay.
Anyway, how if I was going to write fiction about time going backwards and forwards at the same time, that's not that hard. And in fact, if you make it, as we found out since then, you can make a quite high budget movie where you just sort of show stuff going both directions. But like, okay, it was an interesting challenge. How do you actually make that happen like for real? What even does that mean? And at first I was like, okay, obviously I could like either have some things simulate backwards or record some gameplay and play it backwards, but you really want the two streams to affect each other.
Right.
Right. And that's one way, and that's the levels leading up. And then after that, it's like, okay, how do we use this in the story? How do we do something cool for the ending? And like, how do we use this directionality of time thematically for real, right? As opposed to just saying in the story that things going backwards has some meaning, right?
Right.
And that's where that came from. It was just, how do I make a good world out of this? And then I guess when I had that idea for the ending scene, that's when I knew that was the last world of the game, right? I knew it was probably one of the later ones because I had the earlier ones figured out, but I was like, okay, that's a good ending, and there we go. And I was pretty hyped because there was basically 1 week where I had the idea, I sat down and programmed it, it basically worked, and then I sent it to one friend, and he played it, and he was like, yeah, this is cool, right? So there was like a week and a half of like end to end from idea to completely working thing. And it didn't change that much into the final game. It got a little bit bigger with more details. There's more like intermediate things that happen in that level, but it was basically the same idea.
And I'm curious how you decided to do a boss.
Honestly, so the boss idea, like sometimes you're just making a game and you're like, hell yeah, wouldn't it be cool to do a platformer boss? I've never done that. So the name of that guy in the code is called Gun Boss because he was going to be holding like a really big gun, right? Now he just spits fireballs out because I didn't want to think about like aiming a big thing around.
Oh yeah, it looks
I didn't
weird
need
too
that.
in 2D. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. And then it just sort of turned into what it became because it was like, okay, how do I make this interesting? Rewind is sort of the player's strength, and rewind exemption is sort of, it could be a weakness of the monster. Like it naturally is that. Like, oh, he can't get his hit points back. Like what? Okay. Like you could think of other ways to do a boss. Like maybe there's someone who could rewind also or something. But then that gets into like heavily scripted weird gameplay, and I wanted something that was just like a phenomenon, right? So the basic phenomenon of rewindability is like, okay, if you have a counter on something, that counter will not reverse. So if it's hit points, it just goes down and never up. And it's weird because like that's actually how most games are already. But in this game, it's interesting because it wouldn't have been that way unless we made it that way. Like it's very strange. Because if I just have exactly this level in a game that didn't have rewind, it's not an interesting level. Now, of course, in order to do that, it's like, okay, you would have to have more ammo to hit the boss with, right? So that's the other thing that's interesting is there's 2 chandeliers. The chandeliers, by the way, why are they chandeliers? Because I felt like I wanted in the game to at least do, there's the whole thing about entropy going in one direction and things, come apart and don't go together very easily. And I wanted just like a visual of that in the game because I wouldn't feel like the game explored this very well without that. But I like the idea of having something break apart and come together. And so it gives us something to call back to at the end of the game. Then, of course, it's like, okay, well, it's not only the boss's weakness, but it's like, it's also how you get more ammunition to fight the boss is by using rewind. So it's not exactly a level that you could do in another game, right? But it's just the boss's hit points being irreversible is interesting, even though it totally isn't in every other game in the world. And I don't know, that was fun. So these are the two places in the game that have like HUDs that come up, right? So there's the monster hunt level where it like checks off the monsters.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that in the game, right? Like that's the rest of the game doesn't have that. The game isn't about going through different modes. It was like, well, early on I didn't know what the game was about and I thought that would be an interesting thing to do. And then as I figured out the game with the monster hunt, it stayed interesting because I was able to do something really cool with it in World 4 and tie them together, right? And that made it well worth keeping, even though it's weird, right? So with the boss, again, this HUD comes up with hit points, which we could got rid of because I put horns on him that fly off because that's the better game design thing to do or whatever. But then I thought maybe that's too subtle. So it has both now, which is redundant and maybe a little bit bad for the reason of redundancy.
All right, so next world, World 5. I think I remember that's the one that I got a little bit stuck on because you can have, I don't know how you call those monsters, Goombas or something. You can have them jump on your head. And that's hard to discover, kind of.
It's one of the interesting possibilities that is enabled by, the mechanic ghost dude who your game isn't over. She dies, right? Like you probably had monsters bounce on your head before and saw that happen. It's a game ending criteria, or, you have to rewind from there. So you don't think that much about it. Well, you need to actually use that, right? And that's probably my favorite puzzle in the game, actually, because there's nothing there. You look at the level and it's just like there's a platform pretty high up and there's just like a big gap. It would almost be better if it's on a level all by itself
because it would be clearer.
Because it's so like, sometimes these are my favorite moments in puzzle games where you just look at something and you say, no, I see everything there is to see here. And it clearly, I can tell you why this is impossible, right? And then you're like, oh, wait, actually, it was possible. Those moments are some of the best in puzzle games too. And they're very rare. And that is one of them. But I do feel like if I were to redesign the game from scratch, maybe that's on its own level because it might be too easy at that point. Right. But yeah, so the one on the left is actually also, it's sort of about falling, right? In the sense that like you kind of have to be here and then fall and rewind because there's not really a good other way to do this. You kind of have to do this, but there it's sort of about the player and the monster going through or whatever. This is about don't let the monster fall down. And so the platform has to be on both sides of the gap. But over here, we kind of need him to fall off one side because the whole point is you can't get over on the right. And it's more strong if you just have this platform and there's literally nothing around it. If there was like a ceiling over it and I could run back and forth and I just almost could get there, but like it's tweaky and dumb that I just can't momentum myself in the right way and I need the monster for that. That is a much weaker puzzle, right? Whereas this is much stronger. It's just like, that is way over there. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. And that's why it's one of my favorite puzzles in the game, if not my favorite.
Like maybe that would have just been better is if you go into this room and there's just a really high platform and that's it. Well, I mean, there has to be more. There has to be monsters coming out of a cannon that, you know, fall some distance somewhere. But that might have been a better level, actually. Like, I do generally try to frame things that are related on the same level. That happens a lot, obviously. Sometimes it's harder to tell why things are related if you're not me. In this particular one, it's like about the monster falling, right? It's like in the one, so monster comes out of a cannon. To solve one of the puzzle, you actually have to prevent him from falling by like filling both halves of a gap, right? Or you don't have to exactly do that, but that's the easiest way to do it. So you want him to not fall, but then you do want him to like fall, or I mean, it's in a different place, so it's not that clear. Like if he actually fell through that gap, again, that might be a better level. Okay, there's different things to go for. If I were going for just the absolute magic moment, it might be putting, as mentioned, the big jump on its own level. Although, like the thing with covering the platform or covering the gap with a platform is a little bit magical. It's like not as strong. But so maybe they should both be on the same level. But you could imagine changing it so that you emphasize the duality instead of like, I want it to be in the player's mind clearly that I want the monster to not fall, but I want the monster to fall for a different thing. And then the level would sort of be focused around that pit. One thing I will say about that level is it is kind of complicated for what it is. There's like just some little walls and whatever, and it probably could be simpler.
In the interview with Marc, we talked about separating this high jump puzzle into its own level to decrease confusion and to increase focus. This is what that might look like. And I think this version might have made the original game better. But the game as a whole consists of many levels with multiple puzzles on them and only a few levels with single puzzles. If I change this level to have only one puzzle, it would shift the game further in the direction of single puzzle levels, which would change how the game feels overall. But you could do that. You could imagine redesigning the whole game to have one puzzle per level. The result would feel pretty different, I think. Some puzzles would be easier due to increased clarity and focus, and that's probably good. But the game would also feel more like other generic puzzle games, which often have one puzzle per level. And some other basic functional things about the game would get uglier. For example, on the cloud screens, we would need to have a big row of 12 doors every time.
What do you think of the idea of making it more obvious that it's about a monster jumping on your head? Like maybe, yeah.
No, I don't like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can say a couple things to start that I'm sure you've heard me say, but then maybe we can get into something interesting new, right? So firstly, a puzzle is something you might not solve, right? So like that's what makes it a challenge, is because if I don't do a good job, I won't be able to solve the puzzle, right? And some people take this attitude. Like I hate puzzle games where like 10 seconds after you enter the level, it says, oh, you haven't gone that far yet. Let me give you a hint. Like those timers are always set so short whenever people do that. It drives me nuts, right? I have heard specifically the rationale that we want everybody to be able to finish the game and solve all the main, and maybe there's some hard puzzles off to the side, but we want everybody to finish this game. And to me, that's not really a puzzle game anymore, because the depth of appreciation depends on how hard you actually thought about it, or how much, let's not even use the word hard. Like, how deeply did you think about what's happening in this level? How much did you run through permutations in your mind about what could be interesting about it? Then you come out of it with an appreciation. And the more that you just see the answer and do it, the less that happened, right? And so, well, okay, to get back to your actual question,
I just like the magic that I see in that puzzle. And part of the magic, like I said, is from going from this is impossible to I see how to do this. If I tell you how it's possible, not even how to do it, but if I say, oh, imagine the little dinosaur showed up and said, try to get the monster to bounce off your head, right? That's the stupid version of it. I could put a sign saying, beware of falling monsters or something, right?
Okay. Can I just stop you?
I know you wouldn't do
solutions.
This. You wouldn't do
No,
this.
but I'm like, okay, maybe a compromise is you make a little pit where the monster has to fall on your head, and it's right before this puzzle, so it kind of gives you a hint without actually like giving you the answer, and it puts more in your mind because like in the Witness you do all these things where it's like a buildup of the idea, and here you could conceivably say that that's a possibility.
I guess, I mean, honestly, I didn't think about it that hard at the time because I just loved what I came up with. But if I were to think about it now, okay. So you mentioned before, we have these little cubby holes that the monsters walk into and get a key. That's sort of like, at some point, it's a visual shorthand in this game of like, you have to get a monster to this point. And we don't have that many other ways to require a monster to be somewhere. There's not pressure plates even or anything in this game. You could design a puzzle. Okay, like you said, you go down in a pit and a monster can come out of a cannon and you can re-stomp him and he comes out again. And maybe he's going right to left. He falls down in the pit. And then if you stand in the right place, he'll bounce off your head onto a little bit of a platform to make it an easy thing to hit. And then the platform like goes into one of the little cubby holes and he gets a key out for you. Okay, that would be an okay puzzle probably because it wouldn't be totally obvious. But that wouldn't feel magical to me, that puzzle. It would be more like, oh, okay, I see what I have to do here. It would be a little bit cool and magical because as you do have to use your rewind guy to do that. And that's neat, right? Like it's essentially the same puzzle as the harder one, but with more things, which makes it not as good because there's like a key. That there also has to be a gate somewhere. So there's a gate that gets you to the part of the level that has the harder thing on it, right? But that's, one of the reasons why I do video games and like puzzle video games and games with trippy ideas and mechanics and themes and whatever is like, I just have some aesthetic that I like of transcending normal everyday human understanding, right? Of like observing some true thing or beautiful thing that is normally quite far away from us. Like imagine you can't space travel, but there's something just really far away off in some part of the universe where you can't even understand, but you figure out how to go there or see it or something. It's something like that. And this World 5 puzzle, the one that actually exists that we've been talking about, is like that to me. It's like far away, but you can get there in an instant, right? It's not a lot of steps. Now, the version that has the cubby hole and the key and the pit, that other puzzle, in making it easier, it is more encumbered and more Earth-like, more earthy. It's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not magical and transcendent. And then also, in the process of solving the harder one, you're not making as big of a leap because we brought you, now there's a space station somewhere. And okay, you went off to some mildly new place, but like we sort of also provided some resources in the middle for you to like stock up and hang out. And like, that's good if you want an easier game, but it does remove the magic for me. And this is not me saying that I think harder is better always, but harder is better sometimes. Or even harder, I don't even think harder is the operative thing here because this puzzle is kind of hard, but if I could make it easier without sacrificing other parts of it, I probably would somehow. I just don't know how to do that, right? And then as we mentioned a minute ago, if it's too easy, then maybe it's not good
because your mind didn't engage with it.
Marc suggested making the puzzle easier by hinting that you need to make a monster bounce off your head. Here's the idea I came up with during that discussion. It works, but it's pretty ugly because of the weird geometry and the way the player is almost trapped on the left side of the level. In the rest of the game, you can just walk to the next level anytime you're stuck, except, of course, in the boss levels, where being locked in is part of the drama. So locking the player in here on a normal level is really not great. Not only because we're blocking the player's ability to experiment, but because we're diluting the uniqueness of the boss levels. One way that puzzle games end up being mediocre is when designers make stuff like this and just decide, hey, it's good enough. To really produce high quality work, you want to notice ugliness like this when it happens, to see all this weighty stuff has been added to the level, just to make an excuse to bounce a monster, and then ask yourself, can't I find a more elegant way to do this? Then you could try different ideas in your mind or in the level editor and judge to yourself whether they're becoming uglier or more beautiful. Every good puzzle designer I know practices this aesthetic sense in some way. The good news is that there isn't an objectively correct answer, which means you can develop your own personal voice and style. But without some strong idea of what's good that is reality-based to some degree, you won't really be able to make good puzzles. After making the previous level, I was dissatisfied with its ugliness. Remember that the goal was just a hint at the high jump solution by having you bounce a monster off your head. I worked on the level further and came up with this version, which provides a much simpler reason to do such a bounce. I think this version is obviously much better than the ugly one, but if I were to choose, I still like the first revision better, the single screen puzzle that has no hints.
And so, related to the movement code, I know you said in one of your talks that you had to solve a partial differential equation to know something about the movement there.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a PDE. Like my differential equations are not that strong.
Or
but
some
it's
sort of differential
discrete.
equation.
So I did the discrete version,
Maybe not
which is
partial. Yeah.
a convergence series, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's when you're riding on clouds that are moving.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was. Yeah. And so the question I have about that is, was it scary that you might not be able to solve this
Yeah,
case?
it wasn't that scary because it's not like the whole game resides on whether this is mathematically true or not. It's just better if it is, right? Because players aren't going to know either way.
And you could have cut that part, you think? Or if it didn't work at all? Or
Yeah, I would have cut it if it didn't work. At first, okay, like I think I solved the equation wrong at first anyway, and I thought it converged for some speeds and then diverged for other speeds. And so I was going to make something out of that where you have clouds that go faster. I was like, how do I do this in the game? Maybe there's clouds that go faster and faster until you get on one and like it throws you off the level, or who even knows, right? I didn't get that far.
And you were interested in this probably just because it looked cool, or just there was something about.
Well, it's another consequence that you have to explore.
Yeah.
Like, look, if time moves based on your position, well, one of the things you can do in this game is ride on things. So you have to define that anyway, right? If we don't have you ride on something in this world, that's weak sauce, first of all. So then what happens? You could imagine a few things that happen. So you could imagine I get on the platform. Because the platform has speed moving to the right, I'm moving to the right, therefore time goes forward because I'm on the platform, right? And then maybe if I run left, depending on the speed of the platform, maybe I can get closer to time stopping or something. That could be a little interesting, but it seemed very limited to me. Like you could do maybe a few puzzles about, the platform goes at like exactly walking speed. So if you run left, time stops, but only because you're still running off the platform. But I guess you would have to get up to acceleration because I guess the platform would stop moving. It's weird. You need to sort of define like, is there a feedback loop there or not? I thought about that for a little bit and I didn't like it because it just made it more like the rest of the game. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that I have a little bit more of an analog speed control over the rate at which time happens. But that's not even that interesting because the same things are still happening. It's like they're happening a little slower, they're happening a little faster. We have that in World 6. So you end up re-implementing the same effect in a different way, which none of that seemed very good to me. I like the thing about World 4, the way it feels is it's still, right? It's like kind of frozen until you move. And I felt like there was going to be enough to do with that, that should just be the way that it works, is that it really is whether you are moving. But now, okay, does that mean when you're moving you should ignore platform speeds? That would result in like physics that is pretty different from the rest of the game because platforms don't slip out from under you in the game, right? And so I ended up with this balance where it's like, okay, time moves based on movement initiated by you, right? But that is momentum movement influenced by what you're riding on and stuff. And that seems to work well for that level, but it is by no means the only way it could have been executed, right?
So then World 1 is pretty easy. It's kind of like given to you almost. Were you okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the end game.
So it's a reward almost?
It's a time to break the pattern established by the rest of the game. If you don't do that, isn't an end game really? You know, if it's just more levels, but there's fiction that somehow makes it try to seem more important, that to me is not a good end game.
But is it just that that situation of bidirectional time was not conducive to harder puzzles and therefore that's what it was? Or you just...
There's a little bit of that. Like, I have to work with what I find, right? And so I was like, what can I do with this? Okay, I could make monsters go backwards. I could make other things go backwards, but the little plant guy, it's kind of basically the same backwards as forward. He goes up and down. There's the bunny rabbits, which, again, like I said, the movement is complicated. So, like, you could put in some if statements about to make them go backwards. But, like, I just didn't want to go there. It just didn't seem that good, again. It's like, okay, so we made these guys go backwards. Like other things, okay, cloud cannon. It goes backwards. It's the same as going forwards. It's just the clouds congeal on a wall and go backwards. So there isn't one. Other things you kind of can't do. For example, you throw the lever, a platform goes or a door goes, right? You can't start a lever moving and then force the player to throw a switch at a certain time, right? That doesn't make any sense. Now, in the actual finale level, we sort of do have that, but it's like it's the princess throwing the levers and they're kind of causal in both directions, and you probably don't exactly understand what's going on in that case. But when it's scripted like that, you could kind of make it happen. When it's the player doing things, you can't. And so I actually found myself quite limited getting to this point in terms of like what could I actually do? Maybe there's something cool that I didn't think of. It's quite possible, but I was like, okay, this is enough. Like, I think if you jump straight into the finale level, that's a little too hard of an entry. So like here, we've got a little bit of an intro, get used to things going backwards. Isn't that interesting? Is a world in its own right. And then there we go.
So now I'm going sort of back to more general questions. And what's interesting, I think, is when you make a game like that, you have all these elements. Like you have the cannons, the rabbits, the flowers, and there's sort of this big tapestry that needs to like... everything needs to be used more than once and it has to make sense, but it still needs to be... like there's a reason why you made it up in the first place, and that probably is stronger than the reason why you're trying to reuse it. Like it always feels like you're stretching the material to like catch other things, but there's this whole big structure that you're trying to build, and I was wondering if you had any trouble with parts of that. It's a very general question, but maybe that brings something to mind.
With figuring out what the base elements were, or with stretching the elements?
Like you were like, okay, like this is not used, so I should try to reuse it more.
I mean, the thing that we just mentioned about World 1 is a little bit of that, where it's like, it just turns out a lot of these things are not useful in World 1, and so ideally, I might have somehow started with different things.
Right. Yeah.
Although most of the things that I think about maybe don't matter that much. So that's, I mean, I do think like the bunny rabbits they're a little bit, it's a weird thing because I wouldn't want to delete them from the game because then maybe there isn't enough stuff after that. Like, again, they came from, like, I want a harder enemy that you're more scared of or whatever, right? And that's fine, but it's not really what the game's about. It came from this early time. Like, okay, so on the one hand, I did know that this game was about I'm stuff and that I wanted to be focused on that, but I still, like, was having fun making a game and got excited about non-time stuff. Like, oh, there's going to be a boss with a big gun who, like, shoots it. Or, I need a more complicated enemy. Isn't it funny if it's kind of like the bunny rabbit from Monty Python and the Holy Grail? But we're not going to just, like, clone that, but like it's just a little bit funny to do to call back to that in some very vague way, right? So that's kind of what that is, and it's like it's not actually super deep, but it was good enough to build the game with. And then once I've built the game, I'm like, well, I don't know how to replace that with something better, right? So it is what it is. And I think pretty much every game is like that. Every game that I've ever done was like that, where you make decisions early on and those just shape what the thing is in the end. And then by the time you're in a place to maybe question those decisions, it is too late in terms of the thing that you've explored. Like, that stone is in the foundation of the thing that you built, and you can't do a lot about it. Except try again next time now that you're a better designer, right?
You have this option to pause time completely instead of going back and forth. And was that I would guess it was controversial to make, because to me it almost feels more fun to go back and forth and more about the time. But it makes it much easier when you can just pause it and just wait for things to happen. And it's also not very discoverable, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, the way that happened was just in the very beginning, there was just rewind at 1x speed, and then you stop rewinding and the game goes forward again. And there are some situations when you want to rewind a lot, right? So that's why there's speed adjustment. But then also, it doesn't feel that good. Like if you try playing and just rewind at 1x and then forward at 1x. Now, the 0x time speed just came from, well, okay, if you can rewind fast, you maybe miss what you were going to do. So you should be able to go back forward. And then if you can go back forward at 1x, well, we should probably have symmetry. And then do you go from -1 to 1, or is there a 0 in the middle? And it just seemed better to have a 0 in the middle. It does make a lot of things easier.
Yeah.
But again, I think a lot of players don't get that.
I see.
Right,
so it cancels
it's like
out.
Well, and it adds kind of skill ceiling to the game. It adds an advanced technique that you can use. And so, for example, there's one puzzle in the game where it adds an advanced technique that you can use. And so, for example, there's one puzzle in the game where, the plants popping up and down and you're trying to get them in a certain phase with each other. And it's a little bit hard because you can mess up, right? Because the extent of your time ring goes really far, right? There's at least 3 ways to solve it. You can do this very laborious brute force thing until you kind of get the thing that you want. There's a more elegant thing that you can do that's just a few moves where you drop the ring in the right place and you get the guys in the right sequence. And then they're timed so that as the monster walks, the guys go up and down with the right timing, right? The elite ninja move to do is just sync them all with each other and then stop time while they're all in the floor. And I like that because it's like, oh, the more mastery you have of this game, the more you can take this puzzle that seems really hard and like have an expert solution. Many puzzles that doesn't happen, but when I was able to do it, I liked it.